Every parent's worst fear became reality when young Liv found her mother wouldn't wake, no matter how much she shook her or called her name. The little girl ran into the village street, tears streaming down her face, begging anyone to help, but the villagers just walked away. That's when Jorund appeared. He was a giant of a man who had been cast out from his clan years ago for his violent past. People feared him and stayed away, but when he heard that child's desperate cry, something changed in his heart. He walked up to the trembling girl and said 4 simple words that would change both their lives forever. This is the story of how an outcast warrior became an unlikely protector. But could a man with blood on his hands truly save an innocent child from a village ready to abandon her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Ulvik sat like a collection of weathered bones against the harsh Norwegian coastline, where the North Sea's salt spray mingled with smoke from dying hearths. Morning mist clung to the wooden buildings with stubborn fingers, refusing to yield to the pale sun that struggled through grey clouds. It was the kind of place where stories lived longer than the people who told them, where every scar on every doorframe held a memory of winters survived and summers that came too late. Liv Eriksdottir had always been small for her 8 years, but that morning she seemed to shrink even further into herself as she knelt beside her mother's sleeping furs. The rough-hewn logs of their modest hut creaked in the ocean breeze, and somewhere in the distance gulls cried their endless lament. Her mother, Astrid, lay still as carved stone, her usually warm face now pale as fresh snow. The wooden doll that Liv's father had carved before his death 2 winters past lay forgotten on the dirt floor, its painted smile now seeming cruel in the dim light filtering through the single window. "Mama," Liv whispered, her small hands shaking Astrid's shoulders with increasing desperation. "Mama, wake up. The bread needs turning. And Freydis said she would teach me to weave today." But Astrid's chest barely rose and fell, each breath so shallow it might have been the last. The child's voice cracked as she tried again, louder this time. "Please, Mama, I made porridge like you showed me. It's not very good, but it's warm." She pressed her ear to her mother's chest, listening for the strong heartbeat that had comforted her through countless storms and dark nights. What she heard instead was a flutter, irregular and weak, like a bird with a broken wing. Fear crept up Liv's spine with icy fingers. She had seen death before in their village. It was as common as morning frost. Old Bjorn had passed just last month, and little Kari the summer before that. But this was different. This was her mother, the woman who sang her to sleep with ancient songs, who knew exactly how to braid her hair so it wouldn't tangle in the wind, who could make even the darkest winter evening feel warm with stories and laughter. "Someone help us," she called out as she stumbled from the hut into the village's main path, her bare feet sliding on the muddy ground. The morning air bit at her skin through her thin woolen dress. "My mother won't wake up. Please, someone has to help." The villagers moved about their daily tasks with the measured efficiency of people who had learned that survival meant keeping to routine. Orm the blacksmith looked up from his forge, his scarred face showing a flicker of pity before he turned away. "Sorry, child," he muttered to his hammer. "Got my own troubles to mind." Ingrid, who had been Astrid's closest friend before the harvest disputes, hurried past with her arms full of wool, her eyes fixed firmly on the path ahead. "Times are hard for everyone," she said to no one in particular. "Can't be running to help every—" She caught herself, but the damage was already done. Young Harold, barely 16 but already thinking himself a man, actually stopped to look at her. For a moment, Liv thought she had found someone who might care, but then his mother called sharply from their doorway, and he shook his head. "Sorry, Liv. Mother says we can't spare anything right now. Winter's coming early this year." One by one, the people who had once shared meals with her family who had celebrated the summer festivals together, who had helped raise the new longhouse just 3 years past, all found reasons to look away. Some offered weak excuses about their own hardships, others simply pretended not to hear her cries. The message was clear. In a village where every family struggled to survive, a widow and her child were luxuries the community could no longer afford. Desperation clawed at Liv's throat as she ran from door to door, her small fists pounding against wood that might as well have been stone. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking with each word. "She's all I have. Please don't let her die." That's when the shadow fell across her path. Jorund Ironside stood like a mountain given human form, his massive frame blocking out what little sun managed to pierce the morning gloom. Nearly 7 feet tall and built like the great oaks that grew in the deep forest, he was a man who seemed carved from the very bedrock of the earth itself. His hair, once golden like summer wheat, had darkened to the color of storm clouds, streaked with premature silver that spoke of hard winters and harder choices. Deep lines etched his weathered face, not laugh lines, but the kind that came from squinting into harsh winds and harsher truths. His hands, large enough to crush a man's skull with ease, hung at his sides like sleeping weapons. Scars crisscrossed his arms, and what could be seen of his chest through his worn leather vest, each one a story of violence survived. Around his thick neck hung a silver hammer pendant, the symbol of Thor, though whether he wore it for protection or remembrance, only he could say. The villagers instinctively stepped back when they saw him emerge from the tree line where his solitary hut sat hidden among the pines. Even the boldest among them had learned to give Jorund Ironside a wide berth. The stories followed him like his own shadow. How he had killed 12 men in a single battle, how 3 different clans had cast him out for deeds too dark to speak aloud. How he could cleave a man in 2 with his great axe, or break bones with his bare hands. For 5 long winters he had lived alone on the outskirts of Ulvik, trading furs and ironwork for supplies, but keeping his distance from the community proper. Some said he was cursed, that anyone who got too close would be touched by his violence. Others whispered that he had loved once, deeply and truly, but that the gods had taken even that from him as punishment for his bloody past. Children were warned never to venture near his dwelling, and grown men found urgent business elsewhere when he came to trade. He was a ghost of battles long past, a relic of more brutal times that everyone hoped would stay buried. Most days, the village could almost forget he existed until moments like this, when his imposing figure reminded them all that some men carried darkness not as a burden, but as a part of their very soul. But Liv, in her desperation and innocence, saw none of the fear that gripped the other villagers. She saw only a man who hadn't yet walked away from her plea for help. Through her tears, his massive form seemed less like a threat and more like hope given substance. When their eyes met his grey as winter storms, hers blue as summer skies, something passed between them that neither quite understood. "Please," she whispered, her small voice barely audible above the wind. "My mother won't wake up, and everyone else." Her words dissolved into sobs that shook her tiny frame. Jorund studied the child with eyes that had seen too much death and too little kindness. Her dress was patched but clean, her hair carefully braided despite the morning's chaos. Someone had loved this child enough to teach her how to care for herself, how to stand proud even in the face of loss. That someone was now lying still in a hut while the community turned its back on both of them. Something stirred in the depths of his chest, an emotion he had thought buried deeper than his own grave would someday be. Perhaps it was the way she stood despite her tears, or the fact that she was brave enough to ask for help when help seemed impossible to find. Or perhaps it was simply that her pain echoed something in his own battered soul, a recognition of what it meant to face the world entirely alone. "Take me there," he said, his voice like distant thunder rolling across the mountains. The words came out rougher than he intended, but they carried a gentleness that surprised even him. The villagers who had been watching from safe distances felt their blood run cold. Jorund Ironside was involving himself in village affairs, and nothing good could come of that. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers. Others simply melted away like morning frost, unwilling to witness whatever darkness might follow. But Liv felt only relief flooding through her small body like warm honey. Someone had finally answered her call for help. Someone was willing to try to save her mother. That this someone was the most feared man in 3 villages didn't matter to her. He was here, and he had said yes. She wiped her nose on her sleeve and nodded, then turned to lead him toward her home. As they walked, she found herself having to take 2 steps for every one of his enormous strides, but he seemed to notice and slowed his pace to match hers. It was a small kindness, but in a morning that had offered precious little kindness, it felt monumental. Behind them, the village buzzed with nervous whispers and fearful glances. Whatever came next, everyone knew that this day would be remembered for a very long time. The question was whether it would be remembered as the day Jorund Ironside finally brought his darkness fully into their lives, or as something else entirely. The wooden doll lay forgotten on the dirt floor where Liv had dropped it, its painted smile now a witness to the beginning of something that would change everything. The interior of Liv's hut struck Jorund like a physical blow, not from any smell of sickness or poverty, but from how achingly familiar it felt. The carefully arranged cooking pots, the neat pile of mending in the corner, the way someone had placed wildflowers in a clay vessel, despite having so little, it all spoke of a woman who had fought to maintain dignity and beauty in the face of hardship. It reminded him of another life, another time when he had known what it meant to protect something precious. Astrid lay on the sleeping furs exactly as Liv had left her, but Jorund's experienced eyes immediately recognized what the child could not. This wasn't mere illness or exhaustion. This was a woman whose body was slowly shutting down from something far more serious. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps, and the grey pallor of her skin told a story that would have no happy ending without intervention. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice gentler than most had ever heard it. "She was tired yesterday, but she made supper," Liv replied, kneeling beside her mother and taking her cold hand. "This morning she wouldn't wake up for breakfast. I tried shaking her and calling her name, but she just won't open her eyes." Jorund knelt beside the sleeping furs, his massive frame making the small hut seem even more cramped. With surprising delicacy, he placed 2 fingers against Astrid's neck, feeling for the pulse that fluttered there like a dying bird's heartbeat. Her skin was clammy and cold, but not with the finality of death, not yet. "Has she been eating well?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Liv's hesitation told him everything he needed to know. "She always made sure I had enough," she said quietly. "Even when the stores ran low, she said children need to grow strong." Of course. A mother sacrificing her own health to ensure her child's survival, the oldest story in the world, played out in 1,000 small tragedies across every village and town. Jorund had seen it before, in the years before his exile, when he had still moved freely among families and communities. Women who gave their last bite of bread to their children, who worked themselves to exhaustion to provide, who slowly starved themselves to death, one missed meal at a time. What about medicine? Has anyone come to check on her? "Old Sigrid used to help when people got sick," Liv replied, "but she died in the spring fever. And Ingrid," her voice caught, "Ingrid used to be Mama's friend. But after the argument about the barley harvest, she stopped visiting. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. In small communities, personal grudges could mean the difference between life and death, especially for those who had no family or clan to stand behind them. Astrid and her daughter had become isolated, cut off from the support networks that might have noticed her declining health before it reached this critical point. Jorund examined Astrid more closely, noting the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, the dark circles under her closed eyes, the way her hair had lost its luster. This was malnutrition combined with exhaustion, possibly made worse by some underlying illness. Without proper food and rest, her body was simply giving up the fight. "Listen to me carefully," he said to Liv, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Your mother isn't dead, but she's very sick. Her body needs food and medicine, things that might be difficult to find in the village. Will you help her?" The child's voice was so small, so full of desperate hope, that it cut through every defense Jorund had built around his heart. He studied her face, the tear-stained cheeks, the way she clutched her mother's hand like it was the only solid thing in a world gone mad, the trust in her eyes, despite everything she had heard about him. When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen salvation instead of destruction? "I will try," he said finally, "but I need to know, is there anyone else? Any family who might take you in, if—" "No," Liv said quickly. "Papa died 2 winters ago in the fishing accident. Mama said his family didn't approve of their marriage, and mine are all far away in the eastern settlements." So it was just as he had suspected. A widow and child with no protection, no safety net, slowly being forgotten by a community that had troubles enough of its own. The girl would become an orphan, and orphans in villages like this had few choices: beg, steal, or die. Jorund rose to his feet, his mind already working through possibilities. There was Helga, the wise woman who lived half a day's journey inland, deeper in the forest, where the old knowledge still held sway. She might have remedies that could help, but getting there and back would take time they might not have. There was also the matter of payment. Helga never worked for free, and Jorund's own stores were hardly abundant. "I need to think," he said, more to himself than to Liv. "There might be ways to help." But a harsh laugh from the doorway cut him off. 3 men stood silhouetted against the morning light, and Jorund recognized them immediately. Eric the Red, Magnus Scararm, and young Thorvald, who fancied himself a leader among the village men. All 3 wore expressions of cold satisfaction. "Well, well," Eric said, stepping into the hut without invitation. The mighty Jorund Ironside, brought low by a child's tears. "How far the fallen have fallen." "This is none of your concern, Eric," Jorund replied, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable warning. "Oh, but it is," Magnus interjected, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his seeks. "See, we've been talking, and we think maybe it's time someone reminded you of your place in this village. You're here on sufferance, nothing more." Thorvald, emboldened by his companions, stepped forward. "That woman there, she owes 3 months' worth of winter tax. Her husband's debts don't die with him. Since she can't pay, the council has decided the hut and everything in it belongs to the village now." Liv gasped, clutching her mother's hand tighter. "You can't take our home. Mama will get better. She'll be able to work again." "Your mama's dying, girl," Eric said with casual cruelty. "Look at her. She'll be dead by sunset, maybe sooner. Best thing for everyone is if we clear this place out now, put it to proper use." The rage that built in Jorund's chest was like a forge fire, white-hot and barely contained. He had killed men for lesser insults, had broken bones for crueler words. These 3 fools had no idea how close they were to meeting their gods this very morning. "The woman is under my protection," he said, each word carved from stone. "As is her child. You will leave now." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Jorund could see the calculation in their eyes. They outnumbered him, and in the confined space of the hut, his size might work against him. But they also knew his reputation, had heard the stories of what he could do when his blood was up. "Your protection?" Eric laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think these people want your protection, Kinslayer? You think they want the blood on your hands touching their lives?" The word hit like a physical blow, bringing with it memories Jorund had spent 5 years trying to bury. Images flashed through his mind. A younger brother's trusting face, the weight of a sword in his hands, the moment when rage had overcome love and left him with nothing but regret and exile. "Get out," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more dangerous than any shout. But Eric sensed weakness and pressed his advantage. "Tell me, Ironside, does the girl know what you did? Does she know why 3 clans cast you out? Should I tell her how you—" Jorund moved faster than should have been possible for a man his size. His hand closed around Eric's throat, lifting the smaller man off his feet and slamming him against the wooden wall, hard enough to make the whole hut shake. Eric's face turned purple as he clawed at fingers like iron bands around his neck. "One more word," Jorund said conversationally, "and I will show you exactly why they call me Kinslayer." Magnus and Thorvald stepped back, hands moving to their weapons, but not quite drawing them. They had never seen Jorund truly angry before, had never witnessed the cold, calculating violence that had made him legendary. This wasn't the explosive rage of a berserker, this was something far more dangerous. Liv watched in fascinated terror as the man who had promised to help her mother held another man's life in his hands. She should have been afraid, should have run screaming from the hut. Instead, she felt oddly protected, as if she had somehow awakened a guardian that would let nothing harm her or her mother. After what felt like an eternity, Jorund released Eric, letting him drop to the floor, gasping and choking. "Leave," he said simply, "all of you, and if any of you come near this place again, if you so much as look at this child wrong, I will finish what we started here today." The 3 men stumbled out of the hut, Eric rubbing his bruised throat and shooting poisonous looks back at Jorund. But they left, and that was what mattered. When they were gone, Jorund turned back to find Liv staring at him with wide eyes. He waited for the fear to show in her face, for her to realize she had made a terrible mistake in trusting him. Instead, she said quietly, "Thank you for not letting them take Mama away." And just like that, Jorund realized his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a man trying to survive in exile, he was a protector again, whether he wanted to be or not. The child's simple trust had awakened something in him that he thought had died with his brother 5 winters ago. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Jorund couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were yet to come. The silence that followed the men's departure felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering overhead. Jorund stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking out most of the grey light, watching until Eric and his companions disappeared around the bend that led back to the village centre. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly. Behind him, Liv had returned to her mother's side, smoothing Astrid's hair with gentle fingers that trembled slightly. The child was trying to be brave, but Jorund could see the fear that lurked beneath her surface calm. She had just witnessed violence, had seen how quickly words could turn to threats and threats to action. Most children would be cowering in the corner or running to hide. "Are they coming back?" she asked, without looking up from her mother's still form. Jorund considered lying, offering her the comfort of false certainty. But something about the girl's steady gaze when she finally did look at him suggested she deserved honesty, even if it was frightening. "Probably," he said. "Men like that don't like being made to look weak. They'll be back, and they'll bring others." Liv nodded as if she had expected as much. "Mama always said Eric was a bully, but people followed him because they were scared of being different. She said most folks would rather be cruel together than kind alone." The wisdom in those simple words struck Jorund like a blow. Astrid had clearly taught her daughter to see the world as it truly was, not as a child might wish it to be. That kind of clear-eyed understanding would serve Liv well in the dark days ahead, but it also made Jorund's heart ache for the innocence she had already lost. He knelt beside the sleeping furs again, checking Astrid's pulse and breathing. No change, if anything, she seemed weaker than before. The confrontation had cost them precious time, and every moment that passed without proper treatment made her chances worse. "I need to get help for your mother," he said finally, "but that means leaving you here alone for a while. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" "How long?" Liv asked, her small hand still stroking her mother's hair. A day, maybe two. There's a woman named Helga who lives deep in the forest. She knows about healing, about medicines that the village folk have forgotten. She might be able to help. What if Mama dies while you're gone? The question came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of all her fears. Jorund reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a small item, wrapped in soft cloth, a silver amulet shaped like a tree, its branches intricate and delicate despite the tarnish of age. The artifact seemed to catch what little light filtered through the window, throwing tiny patterns on the walls like dancing leaves. "This belonged to someone very important to me," he said, placing it gently in Liv's free hand. She believed that as long as the Tree of Life stands strong, hope never truly dies. "I want you to hold on to this while I'm gone. It will help keep your mother safe." Liv examined the amulet with careful fingers, tracing the detailed branches that seemed to move in the flickering shadows. Who did it belong to? For a moment, pain flickered across Jorund's weathered features. Her name was Freydis. She was going to be my wife. Before everything went wrong, she had faith in things I couldn't see, believed in healing when all I knew was fighting. What happened to her? The question hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Jorund had never spoken of Freydis to anyone, had kept her memory locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart, where even his own thoughts rarely ventured. But something about this child's direct gaze and the sacred trust she was placing in him demanded truth. "She died because I failed to protect her," he said simply, "because I let my anger make me stupid, and good people paid the price for my mistakes." Liv studied his face with the serious intensity that only children possessed. "Is that why you live alone? Why the villagers are afraid of you?" "Part of it." He stood, his joints protesting the movement, "but that's a story for another time. Right now, your mother needs medicine, and I need to know you'll be safe while I'm getting it." "I'll be safe," Liv said with quiet determination. "I know how to bar the door, and I can hide in the root cellar if anyone comes." Mama showed me. Of course she had. Astrid had been preparing her daughter for exactly this kind of situation, teaching her the skills she would need to survive alone. The thought made Jorund's chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name: admiration for a mother's foresight mixed with grief for a child's lost innocence. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pack again. This time, he withdrew a horn carved from what looked like walrus ivory, its surface polished smooth by countless hands. "If you're in real danger, if Eric and his men come back and you can't hide, blow this horn 3 times. The sound will carry to my hut and beyond." "But you won't be at your hut," Liv pointed out with logical precision. "No, but there are others who will hear it. Others who remember what certain calls mean." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain about the network of outcasts and wanderers who still honored the old codes, who would come running if they heard the ancient signal for a woman or child in mortal danger. Liv accepted the horn with the same careful attention she had shown the amulet, understanding instinctively that these were not casual gifts, but sacred trusts. "I'll take good care of them," she promised. "I know you will." Jorund moved toward his pack, checking its contents with the methodical efficiency of a man who had lived on the trail for years. Food, water, his weapons, a few items for trade, everything he would need for the journey to Helga's dwelling and back. "Jorund?" Liv's voice stopped him as he was slinging the pack over his shoulders. "Yes? Why are you helping us?" "That you don't care about anyone but yourself." The question struck at the heart of something Jorund had been trying not to examine too closely. Why was he doing this? What had made him step out of the shadows when this child called for help? He could have walked away, could have let the village handle its own problems as he had for 5 long years. "Because," he said finally, "a long time ago, someone I cared about very much told me that we're all responsible for each other, whether we like it or not. She said that turning away from someone in need diminishes us all, makes us less than what we were meant to be." She sounds wise. She was. And stubborn, and brave, and too good for this world. He adjusted his pack, settling the weight across his broad shoulders. Take care of your mother, little one. I'll be back as soon as I can. Will you really come back? The vulnerability in her voice nearly undid him. I give you my word, he said solemnly. And whatever else I am, I keep my promises. As he stepped out into the grey morning, Jorund felt the weight of responsibility settling on him like familiar armour. He was committed now, bound by oath and honour, to protect this child and her dying mother. The old Jorund, the one who had lived only for himself, was gone. In his place stood a man who had remembered what it meant to fight for something greater than his own survival. Behind him, storm clouds continued to gather, and somewhere in the distance he could hear Eric's voice raised in angry conversation with other villagers. The confrontation was far from over, if anything, it was just beginning. But for now, Liv was safe, and her mother still breathed. That would have to be enough. The forest path that led to Helga's dwelling had not been walked by civilized feet in many months, and Jorund felt every root and stone through his worn boots. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they turned midday into twilight, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of running water, the stream that marked the halfway point to his destination. His mind kept circling back to the scene he had left behind. Liv, sitting beside her mother's still form, clutching the silver amulet with one hand, while the other maintained its gentle vigil over Astrid's shallow breathing. The trust in her eyes had been absolute, the kind of faith that could either redeem a man or destroy him utterly if he failed to prove worthy of it. The irony wasn't lost on him. 5 years ago, he had been cast out from civilized society for failing to protect the people who mattered most to him. Now he found himself in the same position, responsible for 2 lives that hung by threads thinner than spider silk. The difference was that this time, he knew the weight of failure, understood exactly what it meant to live with blood on his hands and regret in his heart. Behind him, much closer than he would have liked, he could hear other footsteps on the forest path. Eric and his companions had wasted no time in organizing a pursuit, probably thinking they could corner him in the wilderness where witnesses would be few and explanations unnecessary. They had no idea how many years Jorund had spent learning to fight in terrain like this, how many enemies he had faced among trees that offered both cover and concealment. But this wasn't about him anymore. Every moment he spent dealing with pursuers was time stolen from Astrid's dwindling chances, time that Liv spent alone and vulnerable in their hut. He needed to reach Helga quickly, get the medicine, and return before Eric's growing boldness led him to take more direct action against a defenseless child. The sound of the stream grew louder as he approached the clearing where Helga made her home. The wise woman had chosen her location well isolated enough to avoid unwanted visitors, but positioned along a natural pathway that had been used by travelers for countless generations. Her knowledge was sought by people from villages scattered across 3 valleys, though few spoke openly about their visits to her dwelling. Helga's hut squatted like a moss-covered boulder beside the stream, its walls built from stones that looked as old as the forest itself. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney made of carefully fitted rocks, and the air around the clearing carried scents that spoke of herbs and mysteries. Bundles of dried plants hung from the eaves, and strange symbols carved into the doorframe seemed to shift in the changing light. Jorund Ironside, came a voice from the shadows beside the hut. I wondered when you would finally come to me. Helga stepped into view like she had materialized from the forest itself. She was smaller than Jorund remembered, barely reaching his chest, but her presence filled the clearing with an authority that had nothing to do with physical size. Her hair, white as fresh snow, hung in intricate braids, decorated with small bones and silver charms that chimed softly when she moved. Her eyes, pale blue as winter ice, seemed to see far more than they should. Wise woman, Jorund said, inclining his head with the respect due to her knowledge. I need your help. Not for yourself, she observed, studying his face with those unsettling eyes. For the widow and her child in Ulvik, yes, I've been watching the signs. The ravens speak of sickness, of a mother's strength failing like the last ember in a dying fire. Jorund wasn't entirely surprised that she already knew. Helga's knowledge had always seemed to extend beyond the natural world, reaching into realms that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. But her awareness of the situation would save precious time in explanation. "Can you help her?" he asked directly. Helga circled him slowly, her soft footsteps making no sound on the forest floor. From her belt hung a leather pouch that seemed to pulse with its own life, and Jorund caught glimpses of carved runes on its surface that hurt his eyes to look at directly. "The question is not whether I can help," she said finally. "The question is whether you understand the price of what you're asking. Name it." She stopped in front of him, reaching up to touch the hammer pendant at his throat. Her fingers were cold as winter stream water, and where they made contact with the silver, the metal seemed to grow warm. This woman, Astrid, her sickness comes from more than simple starvation. There is a poisoning in her spirit, a wound that goes deeper than flesh. To heal her completely would require not just medicine, but sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Instead of answering directly, Helga withdrew a bundle from her herb pouch, a collection of roots and dried leaves bound together with sinew and marked with runes that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The artifact pulsed with an energy that made Jorund's skin crawl, as if it contained life force that had been concentrated and bound by forces beyond his understanding. "This is Heart's Ease root, blessed by the old rituals and prepared under the dark moon," she explained. "It will draw the poison from her body and restore her strength, but only if it is given freely by one who loves her. The root feeds on sacrifice, you see. It requires the giver to take on some portion of the suffering they seek to remove." Jorund stared at the bundle, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're saying that whoever gives her this medicine will take on part of her sickness? Not the sickness itself, but the spiritual wound that allowed the sickness to take hold. Grief, despair, the kind of deep heartbreak that weakens the soul's defenses." Helga's smile was neither kind nor cruel, simply matter of fact. For a woman like Astrid, who has been slowly dying of loneliness and loss, that is no small burden to bear. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as Jorund considered her words. He thought of Liv's trusting eyes, of the promise he had made to return, of the child who would be left utterly alone if her mother died. Then he thought of his own wounds, the guilt and regret that had been his constant companions for 5 long years. "If I take this burden," he said slowly, "will it kill me? You have been carrying death inside you since the day you lost your brother and your betrothed," Helga replied. "This would simply give that death a different shape, perhaps even a purpose. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The pursuers who follow you are closer than you think, and the child waits in fear." As if summoned by her words, the sound of voices drifted through the trees behind them. Eric and his men had indeed followed, and they were drawing nearer with every passing moment. Soon they would reach the clearing, and the confrontation that followed would determine far more than just his own fate. Jorund reached for the bundle of Heart's Ease root, his calloused fingers closing around the sinew binding. The moment he touched it, pain shot through his arm like lightning, and for an instant he felt an echo of what Astrid was experiencing, the slow dissolution of hope, the creeping certainty that death was preferable to continued struggle. But beneath the pain, he also felt something else. The fierce love of a mother for her child, the desperate determination to survive for someone else's sake, the kind of strength that could move mountains if properly directed. This was what he would be taking on, what he would be carrying back to give Astrid the will to live. "I accept," he said through gritted teeth. Helga nodded as if she had expected no other answer. "Then go, Kinslayer. Go and discover whether redemption tastes as bitter as revenge." The journey back to Ulvik took on the quality of a nightmare, with Jorund fighting through forest undergrowth while the Heart's Ease route seemed to burn like a coal in his pack. Every step sent waves of unfamiliar emotion through his chest, not his own feelings, but echoes of Astrid's despair, her bone-deep weariness, the kind of soul sickness that came from watching hope die, one disappointment at a time. He had thought he understood suffering, believed his own guilt and regret had plumbed the depths of human misery. But this was different, softer yet somehow more devastating. Where his pain was sharp and violent like a blade, Astrid's was a slow drowning, the gradual erosion of everything that made life worth living. How had she carried this burden while still caring for her daughter, still maintaining the routines of daily survival? Behind him, the pursuit had become more organized. Eric had gathered additional men from the village, and their voices carried through the forest with the confidence of hunters closing in on wounded prey. They didn't understand what they were truly facing, that Jorund's years of exile had been spent learning to survive in exactly this kind of terrain, that he could move through dense woodland like a ghost when necessity demanded it. But speed was more crucial than stealth now. Every moment delayed was another moment that Liv sat alone beside her dying mother, another opportunity for the village council to decide that the easiest solution to their problems was to simply burn the hut with both women inside. Eric had been talking about debts and taxes, but Jorund recognized the underlying current of fear that drove such conversations. The villagers were afraid of what Astrid represented, a reminder that any of them could find themselves isolated and vulnerable if circumstances turned against them. As he crested the ridge that looked down into the valley where Ulvik nestled beside the grey sea, Jorund caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the village, but not the normal wisps from cooking fires and forge work. This was the thick black column of a building burning, and it was coming from the direction of Astrid's hut. Fear gave wings to his feet as he plunged down the hillside, abandoning all pretense of stealth in favor of desperate speed. Branches tore at his clothes and face, rocks turned under his boots, but he kept running with the single-minded focus of a man who knew that seconds could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. The scene that greeted him at the edge of the village confirmed his worst fears. A crowd had gathered around Astrid's hut, and flames were already licking at the thatched roof. But these weren't the flames of accident or carelessness, this was deliberate destruction, and the faces of the villagers showed a mixture of shame and desperate justification that Jorund recognized all too well. "Where is the child?" he roared, his voice cutting through the crowd's nervous, muttering like an axe through kindling. The villagers turned at his approach, and several stepped back instinctively when they saw the expression on his face. But Eric stood his ground, flanked by Magnus and 3 other men. Jorund didn't recognize outsiders brought in specifically for this confrontation. "The girl's safe," Eric said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. "We moved her out before we started the cleansing. The hut was diseased, you see. Had to be burned for the good of everyone." "Where?" Jorund's hand moved to the handle of his axe, and the crowd pressed back farther. Several women grabbed their children and hurried away, sensing that violence was about to erupt with the inevitability of a summer storm. "The temple," Magnus said quickly, apparently deciding that honesty was safer than evasion. "She's in the old temple with the woman with her mother. They're both alive." The temple was a stone building at the village's heart, ancient even by local standards, and built to honor gods whose names had been half forgotten. It served as a meeting place for the village council and a repository for sacred objects, but it was also used as a prison when necessary. The thick walls and single entrance made it perfect for holding someone against their will. Jorund strode through the crowd like death personified, his massive frame radiating a violence so controlled it was more terrifying than any berserker's rage. The villagers parted before him like water, their faces showing the dawning realization that they had made a terrible mistake in thinking numbers would protect them from a man like Jorund Ironside. The temple doors were barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam, but Jorund tore it away like it was made of straw. Inside, the air was thick with incense and shadows, lit only by a few flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shapes on the carved stone walls. He found them in the alcove dedicated to Frigg, goddess of marriage and motherhood. Astrid lay on a makeshift bed of furs, her breathing even more laboured than before, while Liv sat beside her, clutching both the silver amulet and the ivory horn. The child's face showed traces of tears, but her expression was one of fierce determination rather than despair. "You came back," she said simply, as if there had never been any doubt. "I promised I would." Jorund knelt beside Astrid and carefully withdrew the heartsease root from his pack. Even in the dim temple light, the bound herbs seemed to pulse with their own inner fire, and he could feel the spiritual poison they were meant to absorb, reaching out toward them like hungry tentacles. "The villagers said she was dying," Liv whispered. "They said it would be kinder to let her go, that keeping her alive was just prolonging her suffering. They were wrong." Jorund unwrapped the root bundle, his hands steady despite the waves of borrowed anguish washing through his consciousness. "Your mother isn't dying because she's sick because she's been dying inside, one small heartbreak at a time. This medicine will change that, but only if someone who cares about her gives it freely." He looked at Liv seriously. "This has to be your choice. The medicine will work, but taking it will hurt her at first, and there are risks. Do you trust me enough to let me try?" Liv studied his face with that unnervingly direct gaze that seemed far too old for her years. Then she nodded firmly. "Mama always said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. She asked the gods to send someone who could save us. I think they sent you." Outside, Jorund could hear Eric's voice, raised in argument, with someone probably trying to work up the courage to storm the temple. The confrontation that had been building since morning was about to reach its climax, and this time there would be no walking away for any of them. But first, he had a promise to keep and a life to save. Everything else would have to wait. The heartsease root crumbled into powder between Jorund's fingers, releasing a scent that was both medicinal and otherworldly, like pine sap mixed with something that belonged to deeper, older places. As the powder dissolved in a cup of water drawn from the temple's sacred well, the liquid took on a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Astrid's laboured breathing. "What happens now?" Liv asked, her small hand still gripping the silver amulet so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Now your mother has to choose," Jorund replied. Though he wasn't entirely certain he understood Helga's instructions himself. The wise woman had spoken of sacrifice and spiritual burden, but the mechanics of how the medicine worked remained as mysterious as the runes carved into the temple walls. "The root will offer her strength, but she has to want to live enough to accept it." He lifted Astrid's head gently, marveling at how light she had become, how the illness had consumed not just her flesh, but seemed to be hollowing out her very essence. Her eyes fluttered open at his touch, grey eyes, so much like her daughter's that it made his chest ache with recognition. "Who?" she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Someone who owes you a debt," Jorund said simply. "Drink this. It will help you fight what's killing you." Astrid's gaze moved from his face to Liv's, and in that moment Jorund saw the terrible calculation that every dying parent must make, whether the struggle to survive was worth the pain it would cause their child to witness. Her love for Liv was evident in every line of her face, but so was the bone-deep weariness that had been slowly draining her life away. "Mama," Liv said softly, "please try. Please don't leave me alone." The words broke something in Astrid's expression, and she allowed Jorund to tip the glowing liquid between her lips. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Her back arched as if she had been struck by lightning, and a cry escaped her throat that was equal parts agony and relief. The luminescence seemed to spread through her body, visible beneath her pale skin like veins of molten silver. But the real transformation happened in Jorund. The moment Astrid swallowed the medicine, Pain exploded through his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. Not the sharp, clean pain of battle wounds, but something far more insidious, the slow erosion of hope, the accumulated weight of small defeats and broken promises, the kind of despair that ate away at a person's will to continue living. He understood now what Helga had meant about spiritual wounds. Astrid's sickness hadn't been caused by malnutrition alone. It had been born from the gradual realization that she was fighting a losing battle against a world that didn't care whether she lived or died. Every day she had awakened to face the same struggles with fewer resources and less support, until the very act of opening her eyes had become an act of heroism that no one would ever recognize. The pain doubled him over, driving him to his knees beside the makeshift bed. Through the agony, he was dimly aware of Liv's frightened voice calling his name, of Astrid stirring with growing strength as the medicine did its work. The exchange was happening exactly as Helga had warned. Astrid's spiritual poison was flowing into him, while his own strength flowed back to her in return. But beneath the pain, something else was happening. As he absorbed Astrid's despair, Jorund found himself remembering his own capacity for hope, for the kind of love that made suffering worthwhile. The years of exile had numbed him to everything except guilt and regret, but now he was experiencing emotions he had thought lost forever, the fierce protectiveness of a parent, the quiet satisfaction of daily kindnesses, the simple joy of watching a child learn and grow. "Is he dying?" Liv asked, her voice cutting through the haze of transferred anguish. "No," Astrid replied, and her voice was stronger now, clearer than it had been in months. "He's taking my pain so I can live. I don't understand how or why, but I can feel it happening." The temple doors burst open with a crash that echoed off the stone walls. Eric strode in, flanked by 6 men, all armed with spears and grim determination. They had finally worked up the courage to confront Jorund directly, probably calculating that finding him weakened would give them the advantage they needed. "Step away from the witch," Eric commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed himself in the right. "She's cursed, and anyone who helps her will share her fate." "The only curse here," Astrid said, sitting up with effort but speaking clearly, "is the one you've placed on your own souls by abandoning a neighbor in need." The change in her was remarkable. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes held a clarity that had been absent for weeks. More than that, there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen life instead. Eric's men shifted nervously as they took in the scene, the glowing remnants of the medicine cup, Astrid's obvious improvement, and Jorund kneeling in apparent agony beside the bed. Several made the sign against evil, clearly believing they had interrupted some kind of dark ritual. "Sorcery," Magnus breathed, his hand moving instinctively to his iron knife. "They're practicing the old magic, calling on powers that should stay buried. The only power here is love," Liv said, her young voice carrying an authority that made the grown men step back. "Love, strong enough to take on someone else's suffering, to fight when fighting seems hopeless." She held up the ivory horn, and several of the men recognized it immediately, the ancient call for aid that bound all honorable men to respond, regardless of personal cost. It was a relic of older times, when loyalty meant more than convenience, when protecting the innocent was considered sacred duty rather than optional charity. "You want to test whether the old ways still have power?" Liv asked, raising the horn toward her lips. "You want to see who answers when a child calls for justice?" The threat was clear, and Eric's face went pale as he considered the implications. If Liv sounded that horn, every wanderer and exile within miles would come running, men who had been cast out for violence, but who still honored the ancient codes. The village's current population couldn't stand against that kind of response. But backing down now would mean admitting that their treatment of Astrid and Liv had been wrong from the beginning, and Eric was too proud for that kind of surrender. His hand moved to his sword hilt, and Jorund forced himself to stand, despite the waves of borrowed anguish still washing through him. Choose carefully, Jorund said, his voice rough with pain but still carrying the promise of violence, because, whatever happens next, you're going to have to live with the consequences. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, with the fate of everyone in the temple hanging on the next words spoken. The sound that shattered the tense silence in the temple wasn't the blast of Liv's horn, but something far more unexpected, the heavy thud of boots on stone as someone new entered through the still-open doors. Eric and his men spun around, hands reaching for weapons, expecting to face another exile or wanderer drawn by the commotion. Instead, they found themselves staring at Ingrid, Astrid's former friend, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came a procession of village women, Sigrid the baker, Helene who tended the goats, old Gudrun who remembered when the village had been nothing but 3 huts and a prayer for survival. In their hands they carried baskets of food, clean cloth for bandages, and expressions of quiet determination that made Eric's armed men suddenly look like petulant children playing at war. "That's enough," Ingrid said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her moral center. "This has gone far enough." Eric's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is village business, woman, council business. You have no say in this matter, don't I?" Ingrid stepped forward, and for the first time Jorund could see the strength that had made her Astrid's close friend before pride and fear had driven them apart. "Astrid saved my youngest son when the fever took him 2 summers ago, sat by his bed for 3 days without rest, brought him back from the edge of death with nothing but willow bark and stubborn love." "That was different," Eric protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "How?" Helene spoke up from the back of the group. "How was that different from this? Because she had a husband then? Because she hadn't been reduced to begging for scraps to keep her child fed?" "Because she wasn't diseased," Magnus said desperately. "Look at her, she was dying, probably with something contagious. We were protecting the village." "From what?" Astrid asked, her voice stronger now than it had been in months. "From hunger? From loneliness? From the kind of despair that comes when your neighbors decide you're too much trouble to help?" She stood up slowly, supported by Liv on one side and the fading strength the heart's ease root had given her on the other. The improvement was remarkable, but Jorund could feel the cost of it coursing through his own body waves of the spiritual exhaustion that had nearly killed her, the accumulated weight of too many nights lying awake, wondering if her daughter would be better off orphaned than burdened with a failing mother. "I wasn't dying of disease," Astrid continued, her grey eyes fixed on Eric with laser intensity. "I was dying of shame. Shame that I couldn't provide for my child the way her father would have. Shame that I had to beg for work that barely paid enough to keep us fed. Shame that my friends, found it easier to look away than to admit that any of us could end up in the same situation." Ingrid stepped forward, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Astrid, I'm sorry. After the argument about the barley harvest, I told myself you were too proud to accept help, that you wanted to handle things yourself. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared that if I helped you, people would think less of me, or that your bad luck would somehow spread to my family. And now?" Astrid asked gently. "Now I realize that turning away from a friend in need is the kind of bad luck that spreads fastest of all." The exchange was having a visible effect on Eric's men. Several had lowered their spears, and their expressions showed the dawning recognition of people who were beginning to understand they had been on the wrong side of something important. But Eric himself remained defiant, his pride too wounded to allow for retreat. "This is all very touching," he said with bitter sarcasm, "but it doesn't change the facts. The woman owes debts she can't pay. Her husband's obligations don't die with him, and the village can't afford to support everyone who can't support themselves." "What debts?" The voice came from the temple entrance, and everyone turned to see a figure that made Eric's face go white with shock. Old Thorstein, the village's former chief before his retirement, stood framed in the doorway, holding a leather satchel that everyone recognized the village's official records. Thorstein was a man in his 70s whose word had been law in Ulvik for more than 2 decades before he had stepped down to let younger men take charge. His presence in the temple was unexpected enough, but the grim satisfaction on his weathered face suggested he had come with more than just moral authority. "What debts?" he repeated, stepping into the temple with the slow dignity of age and wisdom. "Because I've been examining the records, Eric, and I find some very interesting discrepancies." "You have no authority here anymore, old man," Eric said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Perhaps not," Thorstein agreed, opening the satchel and withdrawing several pieces of carefully marked parchment. "But I can still read, and I can still count. And according to these records, the official records kept by your own hand, Astrid's husband Eirik paid his winter taxes 3 months before his death. Paid them in full, along with the additional levy for the new fishing boats." The silence in the temple became absolute. Eric's face cycled through several colors before settling on a sickly grey. "Furthermore," Thorstein continued relentlessly, "the debt you claimed exists, the debt that justified burning this woman's home and imprisoning her and her child. The debt was actually owed by Eirik's cousin Magnus, who shares the same family name but is a completely different person. Magnus, who, coincidentally, moved to the eastern settlements last spring, owing quite a bit of money to several prominent village families. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Eric hadn't just been cruel, he had been fraudulent, using false records to justify seizing property and casting out a widow and child who had actually fulfilled all their obligations to the community. "You knew," Ingrid breathed, staring at Eric with dawning horror. "You knew the debt wasn't hers, but you used it anyway because you thought no one would check the records." "Why?" Astrid asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do such a thing to us?" Eric's composure finally cracked completely. "Because this village is dying," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Every year we lose more people to the settlements, more families pack up and leave for easier lives elsewhere. We can't afford dead weight, can't afford to support people who don't contribute enough to justify the resources they consume. So you decided to steal from a widow and orphan her child." "To make your point?" Jorund asked, the borrowed pain in his voice making his words even more cutting. "I decided to do what needed to be done to save this community," Eric replied desperately, "to make the hard choices that everyone else was too weak to make." "The only thing you've done," Thorstein said with quiet authority, "is prove that fear makes fools of us all. And now the question is, what we do about it." The old chief looked around the assembled crowd, Eric and his ashamed followers, the village women who had finally found their courage, Astrid standing with renewed strength beside her daughter, and Jorund still bearing the spiritual weight of someone else's suffering. "There will be a new council vote," Thorstein announced. "Tomorrow at sunset. The village will decide whether to follow leaders who build their authority on lies and cruelty, or whether we remember what it means to be a community that protects its most vulnerable members." But even as he spoke, Jorund could see the calculation in Eric's eyes, the desperate recognition of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Men like Eric didn't simply accept defeat gracefully, they looked for ways to overturn the table and scatter the pieces rather than admit they had been wrong. The real confrontation was still to come, and next time it would be about much more than debts and taxes. It would be about the very soul of the village itself. The night that followed Thorstein's revelation passed with the slow inevitability of a gathering storm. Jorund had moved Astrid and Liv to his own hut for safety, knowing that Eric's desperation would likely drive him to increasingly reckless actions. The dwelling that had been his solitary refuge for 5 years now felt transformed by their presence, warmer somehow, filled with the quiet sounds of people who cared about each other's well-being. Astrid sat by the fire, her strength returning gradually as the heart's ease root continued its work, while Liv dozed against her shoulder. The child had been through more in one day than most adults faced in a lifetime, but she seemed to possess a resilience that reminded Jorund painfully of another young woman who had faced impossible circumstances with unwavering courage. "She looks like her," Astrid said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "The woman you lost. Liv has that same quality, the ability to see good in the world, even when the world doesn't deserve it." Jorund glanced up from where he was sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone on steel providing a counterpoint to the crackling flames. "How did you know?" "The way you look at her sometimes, like you're seeing a ghost. And the way you've thrown yourself into protecting us, it has the desperation of a man trying to save someone he's already lost." Astrid shifted carefully, still weak despite the medicine's effects. "What happened to her?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond mere curiosity. Jorund had never spoken of Freydis to anyone in the village, had kept her memory locked away like a sacred relic, too precious to risk damaging with careless words. "Her name was Freydis," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the fire's whisper. "She was a healer, like Helga, but gentler, more trusting of people's better nature. She believed that violence was always a choice, that there was another way to solve every conflict if you just looked hard enough." "What happened?" "My brother Ragnar challenged me for leadership of our clan, not because he wanted power, but because he believed our people needed someone who could lead with wisdom instead of just strength." Jorund's hands stilled on the axe blade, remembering. He was right, of course. I was young and proud, and thought every problem could be solved with an axe handle. Liv stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and Astrid stroked her hair with gentle fingers. The simple maternal gesture made Jorund's chest tight with memory and loss. "Freydis tried to stop the combat," he continued, "stepped between us just as Ragnar made his move. My axe, I couldn't stop it in time. The blade that was meant for my brother's shield took her instead." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Astrid had known loss herself, had felt the weight of watching someone die while powerless to prevent it. She understood the particular kind of guilt that came from being the instrument of destruction for someone you loved. And your brother died trying to save her, threw himself on the blade when he saw what had happened, couldn't live with the knowledge that his challenge had caused her death. Jorund resumed his sharpening, the motion mechanical and soothing. "3 clans cast me out within the week, not for kinslaying, though that's what they called it, for being too stupid and too proud to see the difference between strength and wisdom. Is that why you helped us, trying to save Freydis by saving Liv?" The question was uncomfortably perceptive, cutting straight to the heart of motivations Jorund hadn't fully examined himself. Was his protection of this mother and child simply an attempt to rewrite a tragedy that couldn't be changed? Or was it something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition that some debts could only be repaid by preventing others from experiencing the same loss? "Maybe," he admitted, "but also because it was the right thing to do, and I've spent 5 years doing nothing while other people suffered for lack of someone willing to stand up and be counted." A sound from outside cut short their conversation, footsteps on gravel, multiple sets, moving with the careful precision of people trying to avoid detection. Jorund was on his feet instantly, axe in hand, motioning for silence as he moved to the window. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Eric had gathered more than just villagers. This time among the familiar faces of Magnus and Thorvald were several strangers, hard-faced men with the scarred hands and predatory bearing of professional sellswords. Someone had paid good silver to bring violence to Ulvik, and there could be only one target worth such expense. "How many?" Astrid whispered, gently shaking Liv awake. 12, maybe 15. Too many to fight directly." Jorund moved away from the window, his mind already working through possibilities. The hut was defensible, but could be burned easily enough. The forest offered better options, but would mean abandoning any chance of protecting the village from whatever Eric had planned. "What's happening?" Liv asked, instantly alert, despite having been asleep moments before. "Eric's brought hired swords," Jorund replied grimly. "Men who kill for coin and don't ask questions about the justice of their cause. He's past caring about village politics now. This is about eliminating threats to his authority." As if summoned by his words, Eric's voice rang out across the clearing that surrounded Jorund's hut. "Ironside, we know you're in there with the witch and her cursed child. Send them out, and we might let you live to see morning." "And if I refuse?" Jorund called back, though he already knew the answer. "Then we burn you all out and tell people you died, resisting arrest for practicing forbidden magic. The sellswords won't ask questions, and the villagers will believe what they're told to believe." Liv clutched the ivory horn she still carried, her young face showing a determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "Should I blow the horn now? Call for help?" Jorund considered it, weighing the possibilities. The horn's call would bring aid eventually, but eventually might be too late to do any good. By the time help arrived, Eric's mercenaries could have finished their work and melted back into the forest like they had never existed. "Not yet," he decided, "but be ready. There has to be another way," Astrid said, struggling to her feet despite her weakness. "Some way to reach them, make them understand what they're doing." "Eric's past understanding," Jorund replied. "Men like him, when they're cornered, they don't think about consequences anymore. They just lash out at whatever they can reach." Through the window they could see torches being lit, and Jorund caught the gleam of steel as weapons were drawn. Eric had brought enough men to surround the hut completely, cutting off any chance of escape through the forest. This wasn't going to be a siege, it was going to be a slaughter, quick and efficient and easy to explain away afterward. "There is one possibility," Jorund said slowly, an idea forming that he didn't like but couldn't dismiss. "The old challenge law, single combat to settle the dispute. Eric's got enough pride left that he might accept, especially if he thinks his hired swords give him an advantage." "You can't," Astrid protested. "You're still carrying the spiritual poison from the medicine. You're not at full strength. Doesn't matter, it's the only way to get them to face me one at a time instead of all at once." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to look at them, the woman whose life he had saved at the cost of taking on her deepest pain, and the child whose faith had rekindled something in him he had thought lost forever. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, "if Eric refuses the challenge or his men don't honor the result, blow the horn, 3 long blasts, then keep blowing until someone comes. There are still people in this world who remember what honor means." "You're not going to die," Liv said with the fierce certainty that only children possessed. "You're going to win, and then everything will be better." Jorund wished he shared her confidence. The borrowed despair from Astrid's illness was still coursing through his system, sapping his strength and clouding his judgment. He had faced better odds in his prime, but never while carrying someone else's emotional baggage or fighting to protect people whose safety mattered more than his own life. Still, as he reached for the door handle, he felt something else stirring beneath the pain and exhaustion, the same protective fury that had driven him to face Eric's men in the temple, magnified now by the knowledge that failure would mean death for 2 innocent people who trusted him to stand between them and the darkness. "Eric," he called out as he stepped into the night, "you want to settle this? Let's settle it like men instead of cowards hiding behind hired blades." The response came quickly, full of the bravado of someone who thought victory was already assured. But Jorund could hear the uncertainty underneath, the recognition that once combat was joined, all the planning and preparation in the world might not be enough to overcome the unpredictable nature of violence between determined men. The final confrontation was about to begin, and everyone involved understood that when the sun rose, Ulvik would be a very different place than it had been at sunset. But help, if it came at all, would not arrive in time to save Jorund from the steel that was already reaching for his heart. The ivory horn's blast cut through the night air like the voice of the gods themselves, 3 long, mournful notes that echoed off the surrounding hills and carried far beyond the borders of Ulvik. Liv had made her choice, calling for aid with the ancient signal that bound all honorable men to respond. Jorund released Eric and spun to face the oncoming rush, his axe cutting a crimson arc through the first attacker's chest. But there were too many of them, coming from too many angles. Even at full strength, he would have been hard-pressed to handle so many skilled fighters simultaneously. The hired mercenaries moved as one, abandoning any pretense of honor as they surged forward with weapons drawn. They had been waiting for exactly this moment when their employer was in mortal danger and could claim afterward that he had been forced to break the rules of single combat to save his own life. But Eric's pride was stronger than his survival instinct. Instead of surrendering, he managed to rasp out a single word that changed everything. Now. Yield, Jorund growled, his voice carrying the promise of death. Jorund's left hand shot out, fingers closing around Eric's throat with crushing force. He lifted the smaller man off the ground, Eric's feet kicking frantically as his sword arm was pinned by the locked weapons and his shield became useless, dead weight. Instead, it met the broad blade of Jorund's axe as the veteran warrior recovered with reflexes honed by decades of survival. The weapons locked again, but this time Eric had overextended himself in his eagerness for victory. Eric saw the opening and took it. His sword darted forward like a striking snake, the point aimed directly at Jorunda's heart. It should have been a killing blow, would have been against any other opponent, but the effort cost him. Waves of borrowed anguish washed through Jorund's consciousness, bringing with them the crushing weight of Astrid's accumulated despair. For just an instant, his guard dropped as the spiritual poison overwhelmed his defenses. Steel rang against steel as Eric's sword met Jorund's axe head-on. For a moment they were locked together, strength against strength, and Eric's eyes went wide as he realized that even diminished, Jorund's power was formidable. The bigger man's muscles bunched, and he drove forward, sending Eric stumbling backward with the force of the contact. From the hut's window, Liv watched with wide eyes while Astrid held her close. The child's fingers were white-knuckled around the ivory horn, ready to sound the call for aid if the combat went badly. But for now, Jorund seemed to be holding his own, despite the obvious handicap of the spiritual burden he carried. Jorund didn't waste breath on a response. He pressed forward with a series of overhead chops that drove Eric steadily backward, each blow powerful enough to cleave a man in two if it connected. But Eric was quick, dancing aside from the worst attacks and using his shield to deflect what he couldn't dodge entirely. "You're slow tonight," Eric taunted as he regained his footing. "Age catching up with you, or is there something else dragging you down?" The first exchange came without warning. Eric lunged forward with his sword, aiming for Jorund's exposed ribs, but the bigger man twisted aside and brought his axe around in a whistling arc that forced Eric to duck and roll to avoid decapitation. The crowd of watchers pressed back as the weapons carved deadly paths through the air. They began to circle each other, feet finding purchase on the uneven ground, while both warriors looked for openings. Eric was younger and fresher, his movements sharp and precise. But Jorund had decades of experience, and even weakened, he understood violence in ways that most men never would. "Honor?" Eric laughed bitterly. "What honor is there in watching your community die one family at a time? What honor is there in being too weak to make the hard choices that survival demands?" "Some things are worth meddling in," he replied, his eyes never leaving Eric's stance. "Like protecting the innocent from men who've forgotten what honor means." Jorund hefted his great axe, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had served him through countless battles. The handle was worn smooth by years of use, and the steel blade caught the torchlight like captured lightning. But beneath the surface, confidence. He could feel the borrowed despair from Astrid's medicine still coursing through his system, sapping his strength and clouding his reflexes. "You should have stayed in exile," Ironside, Eric said as he tested his sword's balance. "Should have kept to yourself instead of meddling in village affairs." The circle of torches created an arena of dancing shadows in the clearing before Jorund's hut. Eric stood opposite him, armed with sword and shield, his face showing the grim satisfaction of a man who believed the odds were finally tilted in his favor. The hired mercenaries formed the outer ring, their presence a clear violation of the honor codes that governed single combat. But Eric had moved far beyond caring about such niceties. The first mercenary's blade opened a shallow cut across Jorund's shoulder as he twisted away from what should have been a killing thrust. Blood ran down his arm in dark streams, but he ignored the pain as his axe swept in a brutal horizontal arc that caught a second attacker across the ribs and sent him sprawling in the dirt. But for every man he dropped, two more seemed to take his place. The hired swords were professionals, trained to work together, and they pressed their numerical advantage ruthlessly. Steel flashed in the torchlight as they closed the circle tighter, forcing Jorund to give ground with each exchange. A spear thrust grazed his thigh, another sword opened a cut on his forearm, and still they came. The borrowed despair from the heart's ease root made every movement feel like he was fighting underwater, his reflexes a half-second slow when they needed to be lightning fast. Eric had retreated to the edge of the circle, nursing his bruised throat while watching his hired killers do their work. The satisfaction on his face was ugly to see the expression of a man who had convinced himself that victory justified any method used to achieve it. "Finish him!" Eric shouted as Jorund stumbled, a mercenary's mace having clipped his temple. "End this now!" The attackers surged forward for the killing blow, but the sound that stopped them wasn't the whistle of steel through air. It was the thunder of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, growing louder by the second as riders approached from multiple directions. The first to arrive was a figure that made even the battle-hardened mercenaries step back in shock. Olaf Bearkiller rode into the torch-lit circle like something out of legend, nearly as massive as Jorund himself, mounted on a war-horse that looked capable of trampling armies. His grey beard was braided with iron rings, and the great sword across his back had drunk the blood of more men than most warriors ever saw. Behind him came others, Gunnar the Grim, whose scarred face told stories of a dozen wars, Thorkel One-Eye, who had lost his sight to an enemy blade but gained something deeper in return, Eric the Black, whose name was whispered in fear from the northern fjords to the southern settlements. All of them exiles, all of them outcasts, all of them bound by codes older than kingdoms. "The horn call," Olaf said simply, his voice carrying easily over the stunned silence. "Ancient law. Who dares to threaten a woman and child under sacred protection?" The hired mercenaries looked to Eric for guidance, but found only a man whose face had gone white with the realization that his carefully laid plans had just collapsed into catastrophe. These weren't village farmers or aging craftsmen. These were the legendary wolves of the northern seas, men whose reputations had grown in the telling until they seemed more myth than mortal. "This is village business," Eric said desperately. "A legal matter of debts and obligations." "Legal?" Thorkel One-Eye laughed, the sound like grinding millstones. "You call breaking single combat legal? You call hired blades against one man honorable?" Gunnar the Grim had dismounted and was examining Jorund's wounds with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of battlefield injuries. "Can you stand, brother?" he asked quietly. "I can stand," Jorund replied, though his voice was rough with exhaustion and pain, "but I'm not sure for how much longer." "Then let us finish what you started." Olaf's hand moved to his sword hilt, and the mercenaries suddenly found themselves facing a very different kind of mathematics. 6 legendary warriors against 12 sellswords, odds that might have seemed favorable until you factored in the vast difference in skill and experience. But it was Eric the Black who spoke the words that ended the confrontation without further bloodshed. "The contract is void," he said simply, addressing the leader of the mercenaries. Payment was contingent on a clean elimination, not a pitched battle against the Brotherhood of Exiles. Take your men and go. The mercenary captain was no fool. He recognized the names, understood exactly what kind of force had answered the horn call, and had no desire to explain to his employers why half his men had died fighting legends over what amounted to village politics. Contract void, he agreed, signaling his men to lower their weapons. We'll take our advance payment and consider the matter closed. Within minutes, the hired swords had melted away into the forest like they had never existed, leaving only the villagers and the circle of mounted warriors who had answered an ancient call for justice. Eric stood alone now, his authority crumbled, his schemes exposed, facing men who had no patience for the kind of political maneuvering that had brought him to power. But it was Thorstein who stepped forward to deliver judgment, the old chief's voice carrying the weight of tradition and law. "Eric Magnusson," he said formally, "you stand accused of fraud, abuse of authority, and violation of sacred combat laws. How do you answer?" The answer, when it came, would determine not just Eric's fate, but the future of Ulvik itself. 6 months later, the morning mist still clung to Ulvik's rooftops, but the village beneath it had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Where once there had been the hollow-eyed desperation of a community slowly dying, now there was the quiet bustle of people who had remembered what it meant to care for one another. Astrid stood in the doorway of the newly rebuilt hut that she and Liv now called home, watching her daughter race through the village square with the other children. The building was larger than their old dwelling, crafted with care by neighbors who had insisted that anyone willing to forgive their past failures deserved better than mere adequacy. The roof was sound, the walls thick enough to keep out winter winds, and the hearth large enough to warm visiting friends, of which there were many. The silver tree amulet hung at Astrid's throat, no longer a symbol of borrowed hope, but a reminder of the love that had saved her life. Helga had warned that the heart's ease root would leave permanent changes in both giver and receiver, and she had been right. Astrid found herself carrying traces of Jorund's fierce protectiveness, while he bore echoes of her capacity for quiet endurance. Neither had been diminished by the exchange. If anything, they had both become more than they had been before. Jorund emerged from his own hut, moving carefully but with obvious purpose. The wounds from his battle with Eric's mercenaries had healed cleanly, but the spiritual burden he had taken on would stay with him always. Some mornings he woke with tears on his face from dreams that weren't his own. Other days he found himself humming lullabies he had never learned, songs that Astrid had sung to Liv during the darkest nights of their struggles. "The council meeting?" Astrid asked as he approached. "Finished an hour ago," he replied, settling onto the bench beside her doorway with a slight grimace. "Thorstein's officially stepping down as interim chief. The vote was unanimous. They want me to take over permanently." Astrid studied his weathered face, reading the conflict there as easily as she might read worry in Liv's expression. "But you're not sure you want it?" "I've spent 5 years learning to live alone," he admitted. "Not sure I'm ready to be responsible for an entire village." "You've been responsible for us for months now," she pointed out gently. "How is this different?" It was a fair question, and one he had been wrestling with since the Brotherhood of Exiles had ridden out of Ulvik at dawn, their work complete. Eric had been banished with nothing but the clothes on his back, cast out to learn what exile truly meant. Magnus and Thorvald had been given the choice between public penance and joining their former leader in exile. Both had chosen to remain and make amends through service to the families they had wronged. The village itself had undergone a deeper transformation. The crisis had forced people to examine what kind of community they wanted to be, and the answer had surprised many of them. Neighbors who had turned away from Astrid's suffering now found themselves checking on elderly relatives and widowed friends. Young families made sure to share surplus harvests with those who had less. The council had established new traditions, regular assemblies where grievances could be aired openly, communal work projects that brought people together, festivals that celebrated shared values rather than individual achievements. "There's going to be a harvest feast tomorrow night," Astrid said, changing the subject with the gentle skill of someone who understood when to push and when to let time do its work. Ingrid asked if you would speak at it, something about what it means to be a community. Jorund chuckled, the sound carrying less pain than it once had. "What would I know about that? I'm still learning how to live among people again." "You know enough," came a new voice, and they turned to see Liv approaching with her usual direct intensity. She had grown taller in the months since the confrontation, and her eyes held depths that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "You know that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give it." She sat down between them with the easy familiarity of a child who had never doubted her welcome. In her hands she carried the ivory horn, which had become her most treasured possession, not because of its power to summon aid, but because it represented the moment when everything had changed for the better. "Old Thorstein says the feast needs a blessing from someone who understands sacrifice," Liv continued. "Someone who knows what it costs to protect people and what it's worth." "And you think that's me?" Jorund asked, with gentle humor. "I think that's all of us," she replied seriously. "Mama sacrificed her health to keep me fed. You sacrificed your peace to keep us safe. The other villagers sacrificed their pride to admit they were wrong. Even Eric sacrificed his position because he thought it would save the village, even though he was wrong about how to do it." The insight was startling in its clarity, and Jorund found himself seeing the events of the past months through new eyes. Perhaps the real lesson wasn't about heroes and villains, but about people making difficult choices and learning to live with the consequences. Perhaps true community wasn't built on avoiding mistakes, but on helping each other bear the weight of them. "The feast blessing," he said finally. "What would I say?" Liv smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like her mother had at the same age, full of hope and stubborn faith in the goodness of the world. "You'll think of something. You always do when it matters." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist to reveal the village in all its renewed vitality, Jorund felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as peace. Not the hollow peace of isolation, but the deeper satisfaction that came from knowing you belonged somewhere, that your presence made a difference in the lives of people who mattered. Tomorrow night he would stand before the community and speak about sacrifice and redemption, about the bonds that held people together through the darkest times. But today, he was content to sit in the sunshine with two people who had taught him that sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from knowing when to ask for help and when to offer it. The wooden doll that had once represented Liv's lost innocence now sat on the shelf inside their hut, surrounded by new toys and treasures. But it was no longer a symbol of what had been lost. It had become a reminder of what endured, of the love that could transform both giver and receiver into something greater than either could be alone.